The documentaries, fictional stories, and poems on this channel contain mature themes including psychological horror, violence, death, self-harm, mental health crises, and other disturbing subject matter. If you're sensitive to dark content, this may not be for you. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Welcome, wayfarers. I am the Howlerist. This week, I'm taking you to a road in Wallachia where 70,000 soldiers marched toward a city they would never reach. Inspired by true events, this is the story of what was waiting for them, told through the eyes of a man who spent the rest of his life wishing he hadn't seen it. Join the pack, subscribe, and hit the bell, because you don't want to walk this road alone. Now, settle in. The birds have stopped singing, and we ride south, the forest of the faithful. I will tell you when I first knew that something was wrong, because it was not when we saw the bodies. It was 3 days before that, on the road south of the Danube, when the birds stopped singing. My name is Khalil, and in the spring of 1462, I was a Sipahi in the army of Sultan Mehmed, whom they called the Conqueror, and whom I had followed since I was old enough to hold a lance. I had fought at the walls of Constantinople. I had seen Greek fire turn the night to daylight and men to shadows. I had ridden through the breach in the Theodosian walls with blood up to my horse's fetlocks, and believed, as we all believed, that no fortress and no army on earth could stand against us. We were 70,000 strong when we crossed into Wallachia. 70,000 men, cavalry and janissaries, camp followers, siege engineers, and a baggage train that stretched so far behind us that the rear guard could not see the vanguard's dust. The Sultan rode at the center on a gray stallion, his armor bright as water, and his confidence was the confidence of a man who had already conquered the unconquerable. Wallachia was a vassal state. Its prince, this Vlad, had refused tribute. It was a matter of correction, nothing more. We would burn his capital, install a puppet, and be home before the summer heat set in. That was the belief. That was the plan. And for the first week of the march, there was no reason to doubt it. The countryside was green and soft and rolling, the rivers easy to ford, the villages mostly abandoned. The Wallachians had fled before us like rabbits before a brush fire, leaving behind empty houses and cold harding and the occasional starving dog. We burned what we found, because that is what armies do, and we pressed south toward Targoviste, where Vlad kept his court. It was on the 7th day that the birds stopped. I noticed because I am a man who has always listened to the world. My father bred falcons in Edirne, and he taught me that birds are the first to know when something is wrong. They feel it in the air before any man or horse or hound. When the sparrows go quiet, he told me, ask yourself what silenced them. I asked, but I received no answer. Only silence, vast and spreading, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. That night, the first attack came. We did not see them. That is the thing I need you to understand. 70,000 men, sentries posted, fires burning. and we did not see a single Wallachian soldier. What we heard was screaming from the eastern flank. Sudden, sharp, cut short, and by the time the Janissaries reached the position, there were 9 men dead and no enemy in sight. Their throats had been opened with a precision that spoke of practice. The blood was still running. The camp did not sleep after that. The second attack came the following night, this time from the west. 14 dead, again no enemy sighted. The sentries on duty swore they had seen nothing. No movement, no shadow, no torchlight, just the sound of men dying in the dark and then silence again. That terrible, birdless silence that had begun to feel like a living thing pressing against the edges of our camp. On the third night, they came from every direction at once. I was awake when it started. I had not been able to sleep since the birds stopped, and I was sitting with my back against my saddle, watching the tree line when the darkness moved. There is no other way to describe it. The shadows between the trees shifted, and then there were men among us. Dozens of them, hundreds, dressed in black. Their faces smeared with ash and mud, moving through our camp like smoke through a lattice. They killed with short blades and vanished before we could form a line. They set fire to 3 supply wagons and disappeared into the forest before the flames had fully caught. When dawn came, we counted 218 dead. I found my tent mate, Farouk, pinned to the ground with a wooden stake driven through his chest. His eyes were open, his mouth was open, his hands were wrapped around the stake as if he had tried to pull it free. The stake was sharpened at both ends, one buried in the earth, the other through his body, and it had been driven with such force that the point protruded from his back by the length of my forearm. I had seen men killed in 100 ways. I had never seen a man made into a message. Chapter 2. We marched on. Of course, we marched on. We were the army of the conqueror, and we did not retreat from raiders in the night, however many of our men they took. The Sultan was furious, not frightened, not yet, and he ordered the pace doubled. We would reach Targoviste in 2 days. We would drag this Vlad from his throne and teach him what it meant to strike at the empire. But something had shifted in the army. I felt it the way my father's falcons felt a storm. Not in any single thing, but in everything at once. The men marched faster, but talked less. The cavalry rode in tighter formation. The Janissaries, those fearless sons of converted Christians who had never broken under any siege, began to look over their shoulders. And then the smell found us. It came from the south, carried on a warm wind that should have smelled of wild flowers and turned earth. Instead, it smelled of rot. Not the rot of a single body, or even a dozen. I knew that smell well enough. This was something vaster, something almost geological, as if the earth itself were decomposing. It was sweet in the way that makes your throat close, metallic in the way that makes your eyes water. And beneath it all, there was something else, something I had no name for then and have struggled to name since. A thickness, a presence, as if the smell were not just a byproduct of death, but the thing itself, death in its purest form, rolling toward us like fog. The horses knew first. They always do. Mine, a bay mare I had ridden since Adrianople, began to pull at her bit and roll her eyes, and no amount of soothing would calm her. All along the column, horses were doing the same, stamping, whinnying, trying to turn. The mules that pulled the supply wagons simply stopped and refused to move, and no amount of beating would change their minds. The men were slower to react, but not by much. I watched hardened soldiers, men who had scaled the walls of Constantinople with arrows in their shields and prayer on their lips, press cloth to their faces and gag. Some vomited, some wept. The smell was not just unpleasant, it was demoralizing, in the most literal sense. It dissolved morale the way acid dissolves metal. You could not smell that smell and believe you were marching toward victory. You could only smell it and know with a certainty that went deeper than thought that you were marching toward something terrible. "What is that?" asked young Emre, who rode beside me and who had been a soldier for less than a year. His face was the color of old parchment. "Death," I said, because there was no other honest answer. "How many dead?" I said nothing. I did not want to guess. We marched another half-day with the smell growing thicker with every mile. Men began to tie cloths soaked in vinegar across their faces, but it did little good. The smell was not in the air alone. It was in the ground, in the water, in the leaves of the trees. It had soaked into the landscape like dye into cloth. I began to taste it, a copper-sweet film on my tongue that no amount of water could wash away. The road narrowed as we approached Targoviste. The forest pressed closer on either side, and the canopy thickened until the sunlight came through only in thin, sickly columns. The birdsong, already absent, was replaced by a new sound, a low, rhythmic creaking, like the rigging of a ship in a harbor swell. I could not identify its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the trees themselves, as if the forest were breathing. It was Emre who saw the first one. "Khalil." His voice was very small. "Khalil, look up." I looked up. There was a man in the trees, not hanging from a branch, not like that. He was on a stake, a wooden pole, perhaps 12 feet tall, driven into the ground beside the road, and at its tip, threaded through like meat on a skewer, was the body of a man. He had been dead long enough that his features were unrecognizable, the face bloated and black, the limbs hanging loose, the abdomen distended with gas. But his clothes were Ottoman. His turban, stained and sagging, was still wrapped around his head. The creaking sound was the stake swaying in the wind. Emre made a sound, not a word. Something more primal than language, a noise that came from the same place in the body that tells you to run from fire. I wanted to make the same sound. I did not, because I was his elder and his example, but God knows I wanted to. "Keep riding," I said. We kept riding, and the stakes multiplied. Chapter 3. I do not know how to describe what we found outside Targoviste. I have spent 40 years trying, and every word I choose feels like a stone thrown at a mountain. It strikes, it falls, it changes nothing. But I will try, because someone must, and because the men who were there with me are nearly all dead now, and soon there will be no one left who saw it with their own eyes. The forest began perhaps 2 miles from the city walls. I say forest because that is the word history has given it, and because there is no better one. But understand that it was not a forest of trees. It was a forest of stakes, wooden poles, each between 8 and 15 feet tall, driven into the earth in rows that stretched from the road to the horizon in every direction. And on each stake, a body. 20,000 of them. The number is important because the mind cannot hold it. You hear 20,000 and you think you understand, but you do not, because you are imagining a number. You are not imagining the reality. The reality was a landscape. The stakes were not clustered in one field or along one road. They were everywhere, covering the plain before the city like a second forest planted in hell's own soil. They lined the road on both sides, 5 and 6 deep. They filled the meadows. They stood in the shallows of the river. They crowned the low hills to the east and west. Wherever you looked, in every direction, for as far as the eye could carry, there were bodies on stakes. Some were fresh, some were not. The oldest had been there long enough to become skeletons, their bones picked clean by the crows that were the only birds brave enough, or hungry enough, to remain. The newest still wore expressions. I saw faces frozen in agony, in terror, in a blankness that was worse than either. I saw women. I saw children. I saw men in Ottoman uniforms and men in Wallachian peasant clothes, and men in the robes of priests and merchants and diplomats. Vlad had not discriminated. The stakes held everyone equally. The smell, which had been terrible from a distance, was now something beyond description. It was not a smell anymore. It was an environment, a medium, as inescapable as water is to a fish. Men collapsed from their horses. The janissary captain, a man named Bayezid who had led the charge through the gate of St. Romanus at Constantinople, fell to his knees and wept openly. I saw soldiers who had killed and seen killing, who had marched across empires and through sieges, turn and run, not in organized retreat, in blind, animal panic, the way sheep run from wolves, without direction or thought, driven by nothing but the overwhelming need to be elsewhere. The column ground to a halt. There was nowhere to march. The road passed directly through the forest of the dead, and no order, no threat, no appeal to honor or faith or duty could compel the army to enter it. I did not run. I want to be clear about that. Not because I was braver than the men who did, but because my body had chosen a different response. I simply stopped. My horse stopped beneath me, and I stopped on top of her. And I sat there in my saddle and stared at what Vlad Dracula had built. And I understood something that I have never been able to unlearn. This was not war. War, I knew. War was the clash of armies, the fall of walls, the negotiation of surrender. War had rules, even when those rules were broken. War was something men did to each other for reasons that could be argued and justified and recorded by historians. This was something else. This was a man speaking directly to the darkest room in the human mind, the room where we keep our knowledge of what bodies really are, how easily they break, how little separates the living from the dead. Every stake was a sentence in a language older than any tongue I spoke, and the message was not, "I will defeat you," or "I am stronger than you." The message was, "I am willing to do what you are not. I will go where you will not follow." There is no limit to what I will do. And you, with your 70,000 men and your siege engines and your God, cannot match that, because your God has rules, and I do not." That was what the forest said. That was what silenced the birds and the army and the Sultan himself, who sat on his gray stallion at the head of the column and stared at the stakes and said nothing for a very long time. Chapter 4. We made camp 3 miles from the forest. No one slept. I sat with Emre and a dozen other Sipahis around a fire that no one watched. The flames held no comfort. Every man present was staring outward into the dark toward the place where we knew the stakes stood waiting in their thousands, each one bearing its terrible fruit. The wind had shifted, and the smell was fainter here, but it did not matter. The smell was inside us now. It had moved from our noses to our memories, and it would live there, I knew, for the rest of our lives. Emre had not spoken since the road. He sat with his arms wrapped around his knees and his eyes fixed on something I could not see. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched as if struck. "Emre." "I saw a boy," he said. His voice was flat and strange, like an instrument with a broken string. On one of the stakes, a boy. He was wearing a blue cap. "Khalil, my brother has a cap like that. My brother is that age." I had nothing to offer him. No words of comfort, no soldier's wisdom, no verses from the Quran that could contain what we had seen. I put my hand on his back and left it there, and we sat in silence while the fire burned down and the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent as they have always been. The Sultan held council at midnight. I was not present. I was a Sipahi, not a general, but the account reached us before dawn, passed from man to man in whispers, and I believe it to be true, because it was confirmed to me years later by a man who had stood in the tent. Mehmed wanted to press forward. He was the conqueror. He had taken Constantinople itself, the city that had resisted every army for 1,000 years. He would not be turned aside by a Wallachian warlord's grotesquerie, however vast. The city was there, just beyond the stakes. The prince was there. Victory was right there. His generals disagreed. Not openly. You did not openly disagree with the conqueror, but in the careful, oblique way of men who have learned to deliver bad news to powerful people. The army's morale was shattered, they said. Desertion had already begun. Scouts reported men slipping away in the night, heading north toward the river. The horses were unmanageable near the stakes. The janissaries were refusing orders. And there was a practical problem no one wanted to name, but everyone understood. To reach Targoviste, the army would have to march through the forest, not around it. Vlad had planted his stakes in every approach, every road, every path that led to the city. The only way forward was between the bodies. An army of 70,000 men, with cavalry and supply wagons and siege equipment, would have to spend hours passing through a corridor of 20,000 rotting corpses on stakes, in the heat, with the smell, with the crows and the flies, and the sound of the stakes creaking in the wind. The Sultan listened to all of this, and then, according to the man who was there, he said something that I have turned over in my mind for 40 years. I have conquered cities, he said, but I cannot conquer a man who is willing to do this to his own people. We withdrew the next morning. Chapter 5. The retreat was not a rout. The Sultan was too proud for that, and the army too disciplined, even broken as it was. We marched north in good order, our banners still flying, and to anyone watching from a distance we would have looked like an army returning from victory, not from horror. But I rode among those men, and I know the truth. We were not retreating from an enemy. We were retreating from a feeling. The feeling that we had encountered something outside the boundaries of what men do to each other, and that to remain in its presence any longer would damage us in ways that had nothing to do with wounds or death. Emre deserted on the second night of the march. I woke to find his bedroll empty and his horse gone, and a small folded note tucked into my saddlebag. It said only, "I cannot stop seeing the boy in the blue cap. Forgive me." I never saw him again. I choose to believe he made it home to Edirne, to his brother with the blue cap. I choose to believe this because the alternative is that he rode into the forest alone, looking for the boy's body, hoping to cut it down, to give it some dignity, and that Vlad's raiders found him there and added him to the collection. I choose to believe the kinder story. I have earned that much. I served the Sultan for another 11 years. I fought in other campaigns, other sieges, other wars that history records in careful detail. I was wounded at Belgrade and again at Trebizond. I married, and I had sons. I grew old in a way that soldiers are not supposed to grow old, slowly, in a house with grandchildren. But the forest never left me. It visits at night, mostly, not as a dream. I have had dreams of battle, and they are different, chaotic, loud. The forest comes in silence. I am on the road again, on my bay mare, and the stakes rise on either side of me, and the smell is there, and the creaking is there, and the bodies turn slowly in a wind I cannot feel. I ride forward because there is no going back, and the stakes go on and on and on, and I understand that I will never reach the end of them, that the forest extends forever in every direction, that it was always there, underneath the green fields and the rivers and the villages, waiting to be revealed. And in the center of the forest, on a stake taller than all the others, there is a figure. I have never ridden close enough to see its face. I do not know if it is Vlad himself, mounted on his own creation in some final, awful symmetry, or if it is someone else. Someone I knew. Someone I failed. Someone whose death I could have prevented if I had been braver, or faster, or more willing to look. I do not know, and I will not ride closer to find out. There are things a man can see and still remain himself. And there are things that change him permanently, that redraw the map of his mind so that places he used to visit freely are now marked with the warning that old cartographers used to write at the edges of their charts. Here be monsters. I was at the edge of the world that day, outside Targoviste. I looked into the place where the map runs out, and something there looked back at me, not from the stakes, not from the bodies, but from the mind of the man who had built it all. Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon, the Impaler. They say he was eventually killed, captured, beheaded, his skull sent to the Sultan as proof. I have heard this. I have read the accounts. And yet, I do not entirely believe it, because the thing I felt in that forest was not something that could be killed with a sword. It was an idea, the idea that cruelty has no ceiling, that there is always a further step, a worse thing, a horror beyond the last horror, and that somewhere in the world there is always a man willing to take that step. That is what Vlad taught the army of the conqueror. That is what he staked into the earth outside his capital. Not 20,000 bodies. A lesson. I am an old man now. My hands shake when I write, and the candle gutters, and the night outside my window is quiet in the way that all nights are quiet when you have lived long enough to stop fearing the dark. But I will tell you this. There are still nights when the wind shifts, and I smell it. That sweet, metallic, impossible smell. And I am 23 again, on the road, on my mare, and the stakes stretch out before me like a forest planted by the devil himself. And the only sound is the creaking, creaking, creaking of the dead. And I am still riding forward, and I have never reached the end.